de guerra. Reclutas de Vietnam. Los años 60 fueron quizás los años más dolorosos para los Estados Unidos desde la Guerra Civil. Como si se repitiera la historia un siglo más tarde, una generación entera de jóvenes se vio involucrada en otro conflicto que enfrentó al norte contra el sur. La sangrienta guerra civil en Vietnam eventualmente hubiera afectado la vida de 3 millones de militares estadounidenses, pero tal vez no tanto como las de los hombres que presenciaron el combate directamente, los reclutas que fueron testigos de la brutalidad del campo de batalla y la futilidad de aquella guerra. Algunos son los hombres de bronce. Para otros son los nombres en la pared. Para todos es el suelo sagrado lo que cada día lleva a centenares a buscar. En el pasado. El monumento en memoria de los veteranos de Vietnam rinde tributo a los más de 58,000 mujeres y hombres cuyas voces fueron silenciadas. Hoy los sobrevivientes del combate hablan por aquellos que no pueden porque ellos saben lo que significó ser un soldado raso en Vietnam.
I didn't really know where Vietnam was. I had never looked at it on the map, had never even heard the name. In high school, I don't remember the words Indochina, Vietnam, or any of that. But we were told that we would be going into potential hostilities. And in fact, we were told that we had no idea how long we would be there. We were told that our mission would be to set up a secure base around the airport at Da Nang. It was made to seem almost as if it was nothing more than another training exercise. And we had been on 100 of those.
Los infantes de marina que fueron desplegados en Vietnam en 1965 esperaban encontrarse con la guerrilla comunista que había estado atacando al ejército subvietnamita. También esperaban derrotarla e irse a casa. No sabían que la búsqueda duraría 7 años.
In the Marine Corps, if you were designated 0311 infantry grunt, okay, it was understood that there are no base camps, there are no forward camps. We were always on a continuous long-range patrol. Everything in front of us, as I remember it, was in the kill zone. Everything behind us, was in the safe zone.
En 1965, las guerrillas comunistas pusieron fuera de combate a 5 regimientos y 9 batallones subvietnamitas y estaban formando sus fuerzas a una tasa 2 veces más rápida que la de los Estados Unidos. El ejército estadounidense tendría que dar la pelea y iba a quedarse. Al terminar el año, 200,000 tropas habían desembarcado en Vietnam y el Pentágono estaba solicitando más.
As a youngster, as a teenager, I think pretty typical of most of the people of my age, we viewed both World War II and Korea as more of an adventure. We didn't have a real grasp of what the reality of the war had been. So I joined the Marine Corps basically looking for some adventure because I was tired of being in school. I'd just finished high school and I wanted to get on out in the world and see what was going on. And this was my opportunity to get a piece of a brand new war that was going to be big adventures. And then the second day of boot camp, I get the word that my uncle had been killed and suddenly didn't seem quite so adventurous anymore.
Para muchos jóvenes, su iniciación en el ejército comenzó con una notificación de alistamiento en el correo. A medida que el conflicto en Vietnam crecía, también aumentaban las posibilidades de ser elegido.
It was easy in the 60s to be anti-war and therefore refuse to give your best in this effort, which is what I did. I couldn't see myself leaving the country. I couldn't see myself as a draft dodger or as a deserter. So I went in, I did my duty, and I did it as an enlisted man, and the attitude was, you've got me, now you got to make something out of it, because I don't support this. It was passive resistance. I didn't like basic training at all, but I knew what it was all about, and I fought every step of the way. Every time that DI yelled, you're left, you're left, you're left, right, left. In my mind, I was going, you're right, you're left, you're right, left, right. And I fought to maintain my individuality. I never really let them take me over.
Para fines de 1966, el número de tropas en Vietnam aumentó a 400,000.
I can remember the plane landing and stepping off the plane. And there were a group of people walking towards us. And they were people who had spent a year in Vietnam or more with the 1st Cavalry Division. And they were going to get on the same plane that we just got off of. And they were going home. And we passed each other. And it was funny, they looked a lot older than we looked. I mean, more than just a year. They looked like they were men, you know, maybe 5 or 6 or 10 years older than we were. But on average, they couldn't have been more than about a year, and they were going home. And they didn't say much to us. And some of them, it was like they couldn't bear to see us. They just walked past us. I expected that there would be more joy, you know. I mean, these guys were leaving Vietnam. You'd expect them to be happy. But there was sort of this weird sadness that maybe they were just tired. I don't know. But they got on the plane and they left. And we walked into this tent and we began processing our way into the 1st Cavalry Division.
Para la mayoría de los reclutas, su misión era directa: encontrar y destruir al Vietcong, que controlaba una cuarta parte de la población rural del país. La dificultad estaba en que Vietnam del Sur tenía más de 16,000 aldeas para ser registradas.
At this early point in the war, in 1966, our primary enemy was a hardcore, seasoned, well-trained cadre of people who had been left behind in 1954 when the country had been separated. These were people who'd been in place for a decade. They had inculcated themselves into the fabric of the society. And they were true believers in communism. A popular conception nowadays is to look back on these guys and say, well, they were recruiting, you know, popular support from the population there. Their recruiting methods were real simple and direct. They would go into a small village, take the village chief, tie him to a post in the middle of the village square, and they would disembowel him. And while he's dying, they would line everybody else up in the village, and they say, this is what happens to people that we deem are enemies of the people. Now, who wants to be on our side?
El Vietcong usualmente estaba compuesto por gente que trabajaban como granjeros durante el día y como implacables saboteadores durante la noche. Eran un enemigo fantasmal apodado con el sobrenombre de Charlie por los estadounidenses, con pocos campamentos de base permanentes y ningún territorio que defender. Sin verdaderas líneas enemigas, el ejército comenzó la edificación de bases de fuego en las cumbres de las colinas. Desde ahí las fuerzas se desplazarían y la artillería podría ser trasladada para aguantar en cualquier punto en que se descubriera el enemigo. El problema era encontrarlo.
Marine Corps' tactic was always to engage the enemy with a smaller unit and overwhelm them with maximum firepower.
My company spent most of the time that I was there operating independently. We didn't do a lot of operations with the rest of the battalion. We moved from place to place and joined in with other companies and other battalions, and basically we had the fireman role. When somebody would get into big trouble, they'd pull us out and throw us into the middle of it. It then became a company level war, and we thought of it that way, and we fought it that way. We would often send out a squad or a platoon to try to entice them into attacking us, thinking that they had a superior position on us, and then we would come in after that. Baiting the trap.
A pesar de que los reclutas contaban con el apoyo de una potencia de fuego superior, el Vietcong luchaba en un territorio que le era familiar.
We were the equivalent of a piece of meat on a hook that being trawled behind the boat. That's what search and destroy was all about. We went out to find the enemy. You went out in company-sized units. Couldn't come up with anything? Nobody would take a swing at you? They broke you down into platoons, and they sent you to the four corners of the earth. Nobody would hit on the platoon? It's too big. You had 35, 40 men in your platoon. Too big. They broke you into squads and gave you things to guard and perimeters to hold on to, see if you could come up with a little action. That didn't work? Well, we broke you down into fire teams and sent you out on night walks, ambushes, find some action. You know, every time you make contact, that means you're going to lose people.
Los soldados aceptaron de mala gana el hecho de que caer en una emboscada significaba dar la ventaja en los primeros momentos críticos de la batalla.
It was like three people that you had to keep alive, no matter what the cost. You had to keep the captain alive, you had to keep the radio man alive, and you had to keep the grenadier or M79 man alive. Captain called the shots, radio man could call for help, and the grenade launcher, he could bring that immediate pressure to bear instantly. So while it becomes a game, you want to figure out how long you can hold out until the rest of the main unit gets in. Sometimes you're engaged and you got an overwhelming enemy. You know you got about 45 minutes before you got real problems.
Un estudio del ejército de 1976 informó que el 88% de todos los combates fueron iniciados por el enemigo. La mitad empezaron como emboscadas.
It's only a few times in my memory that we ever surprised any VC. Walked in, walked out of a clearing, and boom, caught these guys. I remember one time they were washing their clothes and cooking some rice next to a stream. And we came out of the bush and boom, the point element walked right into them. Killed them dead, 3 of them. But that's not the way it usually happened. The way it usually happened was you were walking along and bam, 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 there was a burst of automatic, semi-automatic, maybe a booby trap, maybe a couple of hand grenades got thrown. There was a little bit of shooting. Everybody was on their belly passing up ammos, lieutenants running up and down the line, kids with the radios next to the Louis. If they stood, if they were in fortified positions and they were standing, calling for Cobras, calling for artillery, calling for airstrikes.
La mayoría de las veces el Vietcong era el primero en suspender un combate, desapareciendo entre los matorrales. Para el soldado raso en Vietnam, sería un largo recorrido.
Reclutas de Vietnam regresará en un momento. Usted está viendo Armas de Guerra. Armas de Guerra.
La estrategia militar estadounidense requería que las fuerzas terrestres ganaran el control de las escarpadas tierras altas centrales de Vietnam del Sur, que eran vulnerables a la infiltración enemiga. Este plan suponía que si suficientes enemigos eran destruidos, el gobierno de Vietnam del Norte se retiraría y negociaría un alto el fuego. Pero el controlar un territorio significaba ganarse la confianza de la gente, y muchos aldeanos no estaban seguros qué lado debían apoyar.
You went out in the Mekong Delta is where the rice basket of the Orient is, and everything's a rice paddy down there, and of course we couldn't walk on the dikes because you had to assume the dikes would be booby-trapped. So that meant we had to walk through the paddies. Don't forget now, you're staggered in space. It's not a straight, neat line, and you're dealing with GIs that have 70 pounds or so of equipment on their back. They're tired. Maybe 112 degrees. It's hot. It's muggy. People have 2 to 4 to 6 hours sleep every 24 hours. People are not careful. They're not in a good mood. And so when you walk through a paddy, you destroy a farmer's crop. And it was a standard joke amongst the GIs that every time we went out on a mission, we created 3 VC. And if we killed one, we probably created 10 to find one.
En 1964, a pesar de que las tácticas de combate aéreo todavía estaban en etapa de prueba, el ejército se dio cuenta del potencial de los helicópteros y se apresuró a su producción. Cuando se acoplaron a las misiones de búsqueda y de destrucción, el helicóptero hizo posible que las fuerzas terrestres cubrieran más territorio en un día que antes.
The sky was filled with them. You know, they were like bees. Everywhere you looked, you heard it. Everybody heard it. You know, it's something that stays in your memory. Even today, I hear it. I can remember doing some troop insertions into some large enemy base camps with 35 to 40 helicopters dropping troops in all at once. We kind of accepted it because we were trained in helicopters, you know, but still thinking back on it now, they were everywhere. Everywhere you went, the ground troops looked to us like we were saviors, you know. So when they heard the whir of the blades, they were pretty happy we were coming.
A menudo manejados por pilotos de apenas 19 años de edad, los helicópteros inclinaron la balanza a favor de los reclutas. Ahora el enemigo tenía menos lugares por donde huir.
Usually the way the mission would work would be that a landing zone would be softened up by artillery. And within a few seconds of the artillery lifting, the first wave of helicopters would set down. They were typically UH-1D models, and there would be gunships which would come in with them, which would pepper the tree line around the landing zone. There would be, maybe a company or so of soldiers or Marines which would come out of those helicopters, and they would attempt to secure the landing zone. Immediately behind that first wave of helicopters would come CH-47 Chinooks, and they would be carrying either larger groups of soldiers, or in the case of establishing a fire base for artillery, we would sling load artillery pieces and ammunition. We carried everything.
Los helicópteros también condujeron a los reclutas a la frontera de Vietnam con Camboya y Laos, donde miles de soldados regulares de Vietnam del Norte cada año se introducían secretamente. El ENB se había convertido en un ejército regular combatiendo a los japoneses en la Segunda Guerra Mundial y más tarde, después de la guerra, a los franceses.
The North Vietnamese Army had learned a lot from the Viet Cong about how to fight the Americans. One thing that they did was that they stayed in extremely close contact with us. And what that did was it really limited the amount of effect that we could have through air power, through helicopter gunships, through airstrikes and things like that.
They had a lot of experience in baiting. They had a lot of experience in tactics. They had a lot of experience in drawing you out. They knew what they were doing. They caught on quick. I almost got the impression that they used this for about the first couple of years, just as doing a field study, how we operated, what we were about. And we had a thing, anytime they saw a red hand or smoke grenade, they knew the helicopters were coming. So they draw you in and pin you down, and they knew that this red smoke grenade meant this is the LZ, this is where the helicopters were going to land. And as soon as the helicopters started landing, you know, they were intensely disciplined. They waited until 2 or 3, and then they would pounce. They'd come at you.
We would fly around in a helicopter directly over them. We knew they were down there. We knew they were down there. But we could never pinpoint their exact location because they would hold their fire. They would hold their fire until we would be in our most vulnerable position, going in or out of a landing zone where we were coming in very slowly. That was one thing about being a door gunner. It wasn't so much shooting the enemy. The idea was put enough fire out there so the enemy can't shoot, so you can get the hell out of there.
No importa la baja altura a la que volaran, el enemigo seguía siendo muy difícil de encontrar.
We were flying low level over the treetops with 2 Cobras at altitude, looking for suspected troop movement in this area that was known to have some. And we came across this clearing, and I looked down, and I could have sworn that I saw something moving. So I told the pilot to circle back around. I told him to hover over the clearing. And I looked and looked. All of a sudden, I saw this bush start to move. And I looked closer, and I could see that it was a bush strapped onto somebody's back, you know, that was wearing a uniform. So I dropped the smoke, told the pilot, and I just opened up with my machine gun, and all of a sudden about 14 guys got up and started running. And I just basically opened up on them. if I hadn't looked closer, I would have missed them, you know. And if we'd come back around again, maybe one more time, we would have been in their gun sight.
Con la ayuda del poder aéreo, el recluta ganó casi todos los enfrentamientos que tuvo con el Vietcong y el ENB. Pero los helicópteros y la potencia de fuego de apoyo solo podían llegar hasta la frontera con Camboya y Laos, donde el enemigo ya no podía ser perseguido.
It seemed like we always came back to where we started. You know, we'd go out and we'd make contact, and there would be enemy contact and fighting all day, and then we'd come back to where we started. It was never moving to the front lines in what most people would think of as traditional warfare. There was no taking of ground, so to speak.
Reclutas de Vietnam regresará en un momento. Usted está viendo Armas de Guerra. Armas de Guerra.
Para el final de 1967, había 500,000 de tropas norteamericanas en Vietnam. Pero cantidades mayores de hombres no eran suficientes para superar los problemas que los soldados enfrentaban. La mayoría de los reclutas cumplían su servicio en el interior del país, como reemplazos individuales, y se reportaban a sus unidades siendo extraños. En la compañía o pelotón, el nuevo individuo era desconocido, sin probar, y era usualmente considerado, antes de que presenciara el combate, como un riesgo. Para muchos soldados, la soledad era una compañera constante.
The whole idea of once you got to Vietnam was get the hell out. I mean, day by day, you know, you got shorter and shorter, week by week. So you said, okay, I'm getting shorter. The job you had was just literally stay alive, keep everybody else alive, move ahead, and go home.
El turno de servicio de los soldados duraba 1 año. El de los infantes de marina duraba 13 meses. Cada hombre sabía su fecha de salida. En una guerra sin línea de frente, la sobrevivencia se convirtió en una motivación primaria.
The shorter you got, the less chances you took. Sometimes you look for the shortcut. Sometimes you didn't want to engage the enemy. You just want to, kind of skirt around a particular area. You just didn't want to go down that trail one more time and risk that booby trap, or draw that sniper fire. So you start looking over your shoulder.
We had a destructive personnel policy. The idea was that 1 year in Vietnam was a man's time. That was enough. More than a year was more than you could ask of him. However, what that meant is that we were not in Vietnam for 12 years. We were in Vietnam for 1 year, 12 times.
El sistema de rotación de los oficiales de compañía y de pelotón era aún peor. Eran transferidos cada 6 meses y a menudo dejaban sus unidades cuando la cohesión del grupo estaba en su mejor momento. En lo que respecta a sus hombres, la mayoría no solo fueron reclutados contra su voluntad, sino que también tuvieron la mala suerte de encontrarse en las líneas de frente de una guerra cada vez más impopular. El sistema de servicio militar obligatorio permitía el aplazamiento del reclutamiento a los estudiantes en las escuelas. La mayoría de los reclutas provenían de las familias que no podían enviarlos a las universidades, a pesar de que los soldados de raza negra constituían el 13% del total del ejército, constituían el 30% de las unidades de combate.
If you were a black American, there was 1 chance out of 4 that you'd come back wounded or not come back at all. If you were Hispanic, Latino, a member of the Latino community, 1 chance out of 5. And the rest of the population, about 1 out of 20. So the numbers do demonstrate that the minority population carried the heavy fighting responsibilities.
Brothers came to me and complained, and they wanted to know why we were assigned consistently to a particular sector, combat operations sector. And they want to know, well, why are we taking all these shots, man, all these hits here, We got a problem here. What are we going to do about it? Not too much you can do about it. It wasn't the guy that was walking behind you or the guy that was walking in front of you. It was the guy in the back at headquarters. That's where the racism came from.
Las minorías también estaban representadas desproporcionadamente en el cuartel general. Solo el 2% de los oficiales del ejército eran negros.
I didn't see too many brothers refusing to go to the field or refusing combat. It's a pride thing. It was just a way to come up. It was a way to get ahead in society. That's the way I saw it.
Frustrados por un enemigo que raramente hallaban, la moral decayó entre los reclutas. Sin zonas reales de seguridad, había pocos lugares donde esconderse, especialmente de noche.
They would hide from us during the day. We'd run all over the place looking for them. Very rarely found them. But they always knew where we were at night because we had to have a stationary base camp.
Debido a su experiencia con los franceses y los japoneses, el Vietcong era experto en operaciones con minas y trampas explosivas. Ellos sabían que si solamente un soldado era herido, la moral de la unidad entera se vería afectada.
The vast majority of our casualties were either mortar attacks or booby traps. That was really the hellish stuff. That constantly attrition took away one or two men. Sometimes you'd lose a couple men a week, constantly. You never knew when or how or where. Command detonated or wire tripped. You're very soon to learn that it's random. There's really no rhyme and reason. There's nothing you can do to keep yourself alive. It's random. Where the round comes in are the guys that die. Who the sniper picks is the one that dies. You try to increase your odds, but always you know that it's random. It doesn't matter what you do.
A pesar de su ventaja en potencia de fuego, la mitad de las bajas estadounidenses provinieron de armas ligeras y armamentos primitivos. Más de 75,000 hombres quedaron incapacitados permanentemente.
Sometimes you maintained a bit of distance between people that you served with. Don't get me wrong, you made friends, but you also kept in the back of your mind that this guy could be dead, or I could be dead 10 minutes from now. And so you always kept a little bit of distance.
I was wounded by ground fire, putting troops into an LZ on March 17th, 1968, and also wounded again in May of 1969. Being wounded over there was just something that if it happened, it happened. You pretty much expected it. You had to expect it was going to, if you were in a combat situation. If you didn't anticipate that, you were in for a big shock.
Saying was, in those days, what infantrymen said to each other is like, don't worry, you ain't going to live long enough anyway. If you're complaining about your boots being the wrong size, and somebody else would say, it don't mean nothing. That was the typical comment, don't mean nothing. Okay, no matter what it was you said, you had a fight with some guy, said, don't talk shit to me, I'll blow your brains out. And you turn around and right in his face and say, don't mean nothing. Go ahead, motherfucker. That's how people lived in the barracks. When it came to words, it was life and death. All the time. That was always a quarter inch beneath the surface. Okay? That's how intense it got, sometimes.
Entre breves momentos de horror hubo usualmente largos periodos de aburrimiento. Para el recluta promedio, las drogas fueron una tentadora vía de escape.
You could do acid, you could get coke, you could get heroin, you could get anything you wanted to. It was there, it was readily available. You just had to know where to go to get it.
Varias encuestas mostraron que 1 de cada 3 reclutas fumaba marihuana en Vietnam y 1 de cada 20 era adicto a la heroína. En 1971, algunos centros médicos del ejército reportaron que los casos de drogadicción superaban en una proporción de 4-1 a los heridos en combate.
I can remember getting a few friends together and going up and sitting on top of one of the bunkers and smoking pot and watching this C-130. It was an Air Force plane outfitted with about 12 miniguns, and there was some conflict out on the barbed wire by where we were at. And we just sat up on top of this bunker and got stoned and watched this thing. It was crazy. Thinking about it now is nuts. I mean, we basically used it as an anesthetic. The smoking of pot was something you did when everything was said and done, If you made it that far, I think you deserved a joint.
Reclutas de Vietnam regresará en un momento. Armas de guerra.
Para 1968, el ejército casi había abandonado su política de búsqueda y destrucción, concentrándose en la del número de bajas. El argumento consistía en que si se destruían suficientes Vietcong y soldados del ejército norvietnamita, el liderazgo en Hanoi se vería obligado a sacar sus fuerzas restantes del sur. Pero librar una guerra de desgaste contra las fuerzas de la guerrilla requirió un replanteamiento de tácticas. Al final los reclutas no tuvieron otra elección que luchar como el enemigo. Usaron los mismos métodos que una vez despreciaron. Para el soldado avesado, la política de desgaste significó que por primera vez en su carrera, la medida del éxito no sería estimada según el territorio conquistado, sino por las bajas causadas al enemigo. El hallazgo de zonas probables de destrucción requirió tanta inteligencia como paciencia. Sin embargo, frecuentemente, el sitio ideal se encontraba a lo largo de las rutas de aprovisionamiento que el enemigo usaba en la noche.
I personally was in about 70 to 100 ambushes that we had set, kill zones. It became a matter of course that was something we did every night. Whether we were on long-range patrol or not, we routinely set ambushes. It's like setting a bear trap. You did it, you waited 3-4 hours, if something came up, you had a good time. If you didn't, you moved on. You set an ambush up somewhere else. I was interested in how many bodies and how many people we could rack up. I had to make a report, okay? And I wanted my particular patrol or platoon and squad to say that we took out 50 or 60. That was very important. There was a reward factor tied to that.
Pero el total de bajas no importaba cuán alto fuera. No significaba para el público estadounidense cansado de los años de combate la victoria de la guerra.
You were putting up the patience of the American people against the natural annual birth rate increase of a third world tropical country, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. We could kill 250,000 of them a year, and there were more coming online every year in their potential pool of draftees than we were killing. And the American people never saw 10 to 1 or 15 to 1 or even 30 to 1 as a bargain when that one is their son.
In Vietnam, there was no clear mission. The military was never told to win the war. The military was told, fight here, fight there, take this hill, abandon the hill, take it again, abandon it again, with no rhyme or reason.
Entre 1969 y 1971, la cifra de deserciones del ejército se duplicó y luego volvió a duplicarse. A medida que se emprendieron las conversaciones de paz, nadie quería ser el último en morir. Y creció el descontento entre los oficiales y sus tropas.
They used soldiers, they used kids, they used human beings the way a carpenter used nails when he's framing a house. When he grabs into his pouch and pulls 15 nails out and starts twisting them around in his hand and starts drilling nails, he doesn't stop when 3 or 4 nails hit the ground or one goes flying off. He keeps working. He uses nails. It's a cost of production. And that's the way the generals use men. They use them like a carpenter uses nails. And that's the big awakening. That's the cynicism that hits you. That's when you realize that you're just another hamburger and you're going on the grill. You're a meatball and you're going through the grinder.
I don't remember where it happened or when it happened, but there was a change that went on in my head. I dropped being a disciplined Marine, listening to orders or waiting for orders, and I went on a course of personal survival. I began taking chances, seeking engagement. I took it personal. I took the NVA, I took the Vietnamese as a personal enemy of mine. Because we were beginning to see too many bodies. The helicopters were coming, taking the body bags, bringing body bags. Well, that had happened once too often. And so I began to take it to them. I began to fire on a lot of people when and whenever we encountered them. So there was a fierceness and intensity that, you didn't worry about the rotation date when you go at home. Now you just want to, you want to even the score. You get tired of ducking and bobbing. You want to take it to them. the tactics weren't adequate enough. And so being crazy helped you get through. I kind of like that adrenaline rush that I got to feel a lot. I got used to that. Can we make it through? Can we finesse our way through this? Can we, how long can we hold out? So the lifestyle of war became exciting to me.
War is murder. That's what you're there to do. You're there to kill people. Your psychology gets twisted. Your mind gets twisted. The values that you have are no longer the values that you will have in combat conditions. You become, I suppose, brutal, callous. You become a killer. After a while, you get kind of suicidal. You want to know how far you can go. You're waiting for somebody to call your number. You can't stand the suspense anymore. You don't care if you live or die anymore. And that's when people really go weird on you, and you could see it in their eyes. They just don't look at you anymore. They don't make contact. They're cold. They stop laughing. They stop getting mad. They don't curse anymore. They're just cold. You know the killers when you meet them, and they're scary guys. Keep away from them. Just walk in this way, you walk around them that way. They got tombstones in their eyes. They're dead people. They don't care. They're just waiting for the time when they die, and they don't care who they kill.
Reclutas de Vietnam regresará en un momento.
Usted está viendo Armas de Guerra.
Armas de Guerra.
Para el recluta en Vietnam, su servicio terminaba en un tiempo tan corto como había comenzado. Para algunos, el viaje a casa significaba la diferencia entre el calor del combate y el calor del hogar.
As you got closer to your EPS date, people got real gun shy, didn't want to fly. It gave people a date to look to when they could leave combat, but it also gave them an idea that they would never see their friends again, the guys that they fought with, for 365 days, they're going to leave them there.
I never really believed I ever was going home. And then all of a sudden, the time has come, and you got 14 days, and you're going home, and it starts to become real again that you're going home. And that scared me more than even dying. Going home. Going home where? Going home to what? How do you hold your kid's sister and give her a kiss? How do you come home and do that? How do you get a job with an insurance company? What do you look forward to? Making mortgage payments? What do you say to your mother when you look at her and you want to really say something like, I'm your baby boy, I love you, remember me, Mom? What do you say to your mother after you've been through that? After you've done the things you've done? Seen the things you've seen? I never felt that way. I never felt like I was going home.
When we send young people off to war, basically what we are doing is creating a weapon. The infantryman is, after all, the most complex weapon system ever made. I know it doesn't sell as many tickets in the Pentagon. It's not a sexy budget item, but the infantryman's what actually gets it done. And it's the most complicated, and it takes the most care of any weapon system. Our job as a society is then to unload that weapon. That's the one thing in Vietnam we failed at really miserably, was unloading the weapon. We took them right out of the field and dropped them right back down into civilized world with no decompression period, with no retraining period, with no breathing space. They not only came back from Vietnam, but they were out of the service in days. They'd come back, get processed out, and boom, they're back in, go find a job, son. Just like that. And they had no opportunity at all to even restructure their thinking processes.
It was hard to come back and have your parents say, it's over now, it's over. And I wanted to grab my mother and say, it's not over, it's going on right now. Don't you understand? There was an intensity there. And it was years and years and years before it went away. And it was a good 10 years before I realized that who I really hated was myself. Okay? I hated myself because I survived.
Previous wars could be looked at from sort of long distance. We could watch World War II in movie theaters on Saturday afternoon. But because of television, because of the eloquence of the testimony of veterans when they came back from the war, I think in a way Vietnam unmasks war. I mean, it tells us what war really is like. I've talked to thousands of vets over the years, and I've heard more than one say that on their dying day, they will be thinking of Vietnam. I mean, it has that ability to define, who they are.
When I was a kid, back in the 50s, we spent a lot of time in Saturday afternoon matinees, and cowboy movies were a big deal. What those movies did to us was they taught us a certain code of behavior. A singer by the name of Macy Williams calls it the code of the cowboy buckaroo. All of those movies had one thing very much in common, and that is the bad guys were the back-shooting bushwhackers. The lowest possible thing you could ever be was somebody who was a back-shooting bushwhacker. That was, to the American youth of the 50s and early 60s, that was the epitome of what you weren't supposed to be. When I was in Vietnam, I was probably involved in at least 150 ambushes. When you ambush somebody, that's another word for bushwhacking. So we had been raised to believe that the bushwhacker was the lowest possible form of bad guy. We were told to go out and do things that we had spent our entire life being taught were un-American. And then expected to just forget that going about our life. And lots of Vietnam veterans didn't forget it.
La historia registrará que después del fin de la guerra, casi 10 años transcurrieron antes de que los veteranos de Vietnam fueran bienvenidos a casa. Cuando fue consagrado el monumento a su memoria en 1982, la nación por la que lucharon se encontró cara a cara con los nombres de sus muertos y comenzó el doloroso proceso de comprensión sobre lo sucedido en Vietnam.
I think one of the things that we've learned is that you can't just wander into a country someplace having good intentions and a mighty military and expect to automatically succeed.
I don't think anybody that ever goes to war ever comes back the same way. I think some cultures understand that. And America, the celluloid culture, I don't know what it is we understand. I don't know if we know what reality is anymore. We're so immersed in the hot medias and distractions daily that I don't know if anybody has a chance to understand things like war anymore. You just either experience it or you don't.
If I see him in the eyes, and I can tell, I can tell a Vietnam veteran. There's a look, there's a depth, that you see, and you recognize it because you've seen it, and you've seen how it was caused, So you see that in them, and you know instinctively that they are a veteran, And that was kind of the first couple times I recognized that, it was kind of shocking because it's sort of like a shining, so to speak, where It's an intuitive thing, and it's really out of your control. But it also reinforced that there is a power there that was brought on by that experience.
27 years later, after sorting it out, processing the whole thing, that need for that adrenaline, that need for that one more patrol, that excitement is, it's kind of leaving me. And now there's another need for me to kind of settle down and build a family, achieve some goals, desire to be normal.
Para muchos de los hombres que se vieron obligados a soportar la brutalidad del combate, el servicio de Vietnam produjo más una sensación de vacío que de realización. La falta aparente de propósito, la ausencia de una victoria decisiva y un público ingrato se combinaron para hacer de Vietnam uno de los capítulos más oscuros de las vidas de estos guerreros. Después de años de indiferencia, las heridas de la guerra han comenzado a sanar, en momentos en que la nación se esfuerza por rectificar. Hoy el monumento en memoria a la guerra de Vietnam tiene más visitantes que cualquier otro en Washington, D.C. Se ha convertido en un lugar especial, donde veteranos y el público pueden finalmente rendir juntos un tributo a los que quedaron atrás y, más importante aún, recordar lo que allí pasó.